Good morning. My name is Malcolm Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral. It is so good to see all of you here today, this morning. We're very, very grateful to have Jeff Chang as our guest. Jeff is an expert in the things that I just most want to know right now. The Cathedral is we have a theme every year. Our theme this year is the Year of Truth. Mm-hmm. And Jeff has been studying the truth of music, the truth of race in America, the truth of inequality, the truth of resegregation, and that's an area that I just feel like we all have to learn so much more about, and so I'm so grateful that you're here. Mm-hmm. Last week we talked to Robert Sapolsky in part about the differences in our brains and how we approach us's versus thems, people who are on our side and people on those side, and just how quickly our brain registers a difference in a person's ethnicity or color. Mm-hmm. And this week we're going to be talking about more what that means on a social level. Our guest today is a critically acclaimed, award-winning journalist and author. The focus of his work has been on culture, politics, the arts, and music. As the co-founder of Culture Strike and Color Lines, executive director of the Institute for Diversity in the Arts at Stanford University, and currently vice president of narrative arts and culture for the leading racial justice organization, Race Forward, the Center for Racial Justice and Innovation. His newest book, We Gon' Be All Right, Notes on Race and Resegregation, was named Northern California's Nonfiction Book of the Year, and the Washington Post declared it the smartest book of the year. That's impressive. We have in our audience David Kaiman Kin, who's an expert in religion, and I think he's a close second. If he he's got very smart books. So please join me in welcoming Jeff Chang.
Thank you.
You know, so much that you wrote, it was so illuminating to me, but one of my favorite parts of this is that you just helped pull the veil past my eyes. You know, my wife Heidi grew up in Hawaii.
Yes.
And I love your essay about becoming an Asian American. It was so wise. Just the whole structure of race in Hawaii is just so entirely different than it is in the mainland. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just your experience of race growing up, and then just what it was like to come to the mainland and kind of have to reconceptualize everything.
Yeah. That was a very personal chapter, and in general, my writing is a little bit more
about other people.
And so this particular chapter, because most of my work has been kind of around race, it's been around culture, it's been around popular culture in a lot of respects, and it's been sort of critical and sort of bringing together history and the interchange between sort of culture and power, culture and politics. Yeah. But this particular book is a book of essays about resegregation, and it came out of my previous book, Who We Be, which was looking at the arc of visual culture over the last 50 years.
It's a beautiful book, by the way.
Thank you so much.
So much care went into the images, and they're so powerful.
There's so much to write about, and the thought there was to kind of parallel the history of the civil rights movement and the subsequent multiculturalism movement, and what was happening in the culture at the same time. Mm. And at some point, I realized that there was this great divergence, and that in some ways, culture is really the only thing that is keeping us together.
Yeah.
That what we've seen over the last 50 years has been a dismantling of a lot of the structures that were set up by organizers, by grassroots movement from poor folks and in particular black people, African American leadership around these kinds of questions, around this freedom movement, that those structures have been dismantled, and that was leaving us more unequal than ever.
Right.
But at the same time, the popular culture had become more desegregated, and so I was trying to get at some of that paradox.
Right. And it's like we look to the future and we kind of imagine either steady progress or steady decline, but it's so much more of a mixed bag, and that's one of the things I think you appreciate in all your work.
It's super complicated.
Yeah.
And at some point, my editor told me, well, this is all well and good, and thank you, and blah, 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 blah. It's good stuff. Okay, Jeff. But what about you? and that was the question that I most dreaded.
Yeah.
I didn't really want to get into my personal story because I don't know. I grew up very much local culture style, and I was always taught like you don't necessarily want to self-aggrandize. You don't want to aggrandize yourself.
Completely.
You're one of a community, and you're very much aware. And also, I'm like the first son in my family, Chinese Hawaiian family, and so you're made very aware of your responsibility, right? In the family structure. So I just never really wanted to do that. But she pushed me, and I said, okay, well, I guess I have to do this. And so the short thing is to say that, all of my politics, all of the way that I approach my work comes from, this recognition of history that I have been given and allowed so many opportunities that all of my ancestors, all my elders have not been afforded. And just very much aware of what that means. And in conjunction with that, I'm very, very aware of the debts that I and we, I think, those of us who are born Asian American, who are born Pacific Islander in this country, owe to the Black freedom struggle.
Right.
And so.
Well, that's something I just don't remember seeing so much of in your writing. But I mean, there definitely was a Hawaiian Renaissance, and I mean,
absolutely.
I mean, you were standing on the shoulders of those. I mean, and you knew them as you were growing up, probably.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and it was so deeply informed by the civil rights movement. So I love that point because on the one hand, like the racial scene is just so different in Hawaii, and the other part is that there's still interchange back and forth. Talk a little bit about just kind of how you became aware of kind of the civil rights movement on the mainland as you were growing up in Hawaii.
Through music.
Oh yeah, right, of course. Reggae music.
Yeah, reggae music.
That's what I love too. You explain so much stuff in reggae that help. I mean, I just think that like my Hawaiian brothers and sisters, they they're so much more savvy about that kind of stuff and style. And you did a great job of helping me see the connection between reggae and hip hop, which I just didn't think about. I'm so ignorant. I mean,
no, it was for me, growing up first, like just being a fan of music. For whatever reason, I just really took to music. So. AM radio, yacht rock, and,
right, of course.
and R&B, and disco, and then like I lived on the eastern end of the island, and so during nights when it was really like foggy or stormy, you could tune the FM dial to this freeform station that was in upcountry Maui called Ka'oi.
Yeah, of course.
And KAOI. And they would have these shows where these DJs would just play like hours of Peter Tosh and Bob Marley.
Right.
And I'd be like, wow, what is this about? Get up, stand up for your rights. And at the same time that this is happening, in the local culture, there's a land movement.
Right.
Which, my grandparents were on the windward side of the island, on the countryside of the island, and they were very working class. My dad's city folks who were working class and then were able to build a business. But the windward side was something that was always really looming large in our imagination, and there were these land fights over development on the windward side and in these two valleys called Waiahole, Waikane, and we used to always drive, up that way to go, on vacation on the North Shore or whatever. And I would always be struck by what are all these signs about?
Oh, yeah, completely.
And I'd read in the newspaper about these land protests. And the music was very political, was very politicized. And so I could relate that to like what they were talking about in reggae music. And that was something that made me think, oh, wow, this is actually bigger than just what's happening
on this little island.
Yeah,
in
on this
the
little
middle
island.
Of the Pacific.
Like, this is actually a universal type of thing. And that led me to a lot more, like hearing R&B in a new way, hearing Aretha Franklin and Marvin Gaye in a new kind of a way. And then, of course, when hip-hop comes along, it was interesting because there had been a lot of, in the period after this, there had been a lot of development in the city. All these buildings went up.
Yeah, completely.
And I was mad about that.
Yeah.
But in a pre-political kind of way, I guess. And so I became a graffiti tagger. I was just tagging everything and writing and all that kind of stuff.
I wonder if I've
Casper
seen your
likes
work.
this. Casper knows what I'm talking about.
Yeah, he does.
But you know, seeing these kids who had their own walk, who had their own talk, who didn't care. They had developed this own kind of culture out of being abandoned socially. That was everything I wanted to know about. So that was how I got into hip hop. The sort of, you know, folk music, the Hawaiian folk music was a generation before me. And then my generation was the first generation to kind of come up with hip hop. Let me say one more thing too, which is really, really crucial and critical, which is that I was part of the last generation that did not have Hawaiian language.
Right, of course.
Immersion.
It was still illegal when you were a child.
That's right. And so culturally, I think all of us were kind of searching for something, you know? And so I grew up more culturally Chinese and I grew up culturally Native Hawaiian. And I never had access to language in that kind of a way. And in fact, you know, in some ways, like when we were coming up, it was like, if you didn't go to Kamehameha school, you know, there was a huge gap.
Right, exactly.
And now of course, this new generation, my nephews and nieces, have Hawaiian language from the time they're preschool all the way up to now, and so the renaissance is powerful and it's continuing.
And you know, it's funny. Just as we're talking, I mean, I had this idea, this obvious. We should have seen it before. But what it creates is a structure where, like, the elders know less about the culture than the new people, the younger people, because they're in that one way about language and music and the performing arts, etc. There is much more formal education for the generation just below us.
Well, it's a little more complicated than that, because I think people of my generation are now the bridge generation, so they're teaching, you know, a lot of these classes. But it's similar to what I've seen, say, with Native Alaskan cultures. It's the process of language recovery is also a process of cultural recovery, and it's literally putting together these pieces back together into a complete worldview that really makes sense. But in some ways, yes, like I look at my nieces and nephews and what they're doing and learning, and I want to sit down at their feet and learn everything that I can from what they're doing.
Yeah, it's so interesting because you've done such a good job of kind of taking those early lessons and just applying them in this different context. What was it like when you first came to Berkeley? What was your? I mean, Jeff and I are classmates from college. Classmates that, like, I was aware of you.
We were probably in the same class.
Well, I was
totally
the
same classes,
Jeff.
actually.
I think this is right. Maybe I'm wrong, but I mean, the way I know Jeff is that there's like a bunch of guys carrying signs on the Sproul Plaza saying "Vote for Jeff Chang for ASUC," and I think you were elected. Is that right?
I was.
Yeah, exactly. So it was a successful campaign. You know, I mean, how many people are launching political campaigns that 35 years later the person remembers, you know? But what was it like for you? I mean, for one thing, I just don't remember. I mean, my wife went to UCI. She was the only one from her school to ever go there. You know, I mean, now there's more kids going there. But I mean, because the UC fee structure has an out-of-state tuition, I think it just meant there were just fewer local people than we would have had otherwise. But what was it like when you first kind of got on the ground there? Did you move into Cheney or something like that?
I lived in Griffiths Hall.
Griffiths,
in Unit 2.
Like,
Were you in Cheney?
No.
So I was nearby, but well, Berkeley was a revelation. In both ways, it was a revelation in the sense of, wow, all of these people. Like, immediately, I got to meet people. Like, one of the first people I met was a young journalist who had just come back from Indonesia and had been in the Philippines before that, when it was still under martial law.
Wow.
And so I was learning all about all these different types of things from
well, in Hawaii, was so much more dialed into what was the news you get in Hawaii was so much more filled with what was happening in the Philippines too. So you already had that basis.
I mean, it was real because like there's literally like Marcos like
coming over
to Hawaii after. But so I was all of these things that I really wanted to know about that was happening in the world, and the inspiration of these student movements. I mean, the thing that really drew my attention and my energies was the anti-apartheid
Yeah, same
movement.
with me. I mean, that was such a.
Yeah.
I mean, that's when we first saw each other today. I was like, there are things that we did and happened to us that I just didn't understand at the time, but I'm getting to understand better now. I mean, like, what are your recollections? I mean, do you remember the shanty towns?
Yes, I was there. Yeah. That was that night that they tore up the shanty towns at California Hall was is indelible in my mind. That was sort of the moment at which I was like I completely jumped off the fence.
Yeah.
You know, I was like on the fence about it, and I was hanging out with an activist who was a veteran of the anti-Marcos protests in the Philippines, and he just knew a lot. And I knew nothing.
Yeah.
And so he and I would spend the whole night sitting there, and he would be schooling me on resistance movements.
Yeah.
And what's indelible to me is that in the morning when the police came, when the Oakland police came.
Just to paint a picture, I mean, we basically wake up, and all of a sudden there's 140 police officers everywhere in riot gear, and there's helicopters flying around the campus.
Yeah.
And so you would go to bed, and it's like a normal college day, and you wake up, and that's the scene. But
so it's basically there had been an encampment in front of the administration building at California Hall, which is right next to Moffitt Undergraduate Library, and this had gone on for, I want to say, about a month or something, and
it was about divestment. So divesting from companies that were investing in South Africa. That was the issue that was at stake.
Mm-hmm. And for whatever reason, they chose this evening, to come in. And so they came in before sunrise, and they had a bus they were going to load all the folks that they arrested into. And in front of it were 3 lines of cops in complete riot gear and tear gas, the masks, the whole thing, batons. And for whatever reason, I ran up and I just sat down. And in a few seconds, everybody was sitting down, but they were sitting down behind me. I was like, what's going on
That was
here?
me back there.
I was like, no, like, you guys are supposed to be over here. And luckily, Lloyd was there. Lloyd Nebres was this activist. And so as they started moving in, he came in and like scooped me up and pulled me out, and the baton was like, wow, like that.
Yeah.
But we ended up doing that like 4 more times. Like it was there, and then at Sather Gate, and then it was all mayhem as the sun was coming up because they were trying to clear everybody out before school started.
Yeah.
So I was lucky because people I knew had gotten beaten that day, and I was just bewildered, just like why would they send out the hardest of the hardened cops out here around a peaceful protest around divestment, in the middle of April.
Right.
That led me on this sort of journey, I suppose.
It showed me, in just like very real terms, who's in charge.
Right.
That there's this veneer of like civility and peacefulness, but really behind this, and it just doesn't take much to cross that line, and all of a sudden you see what's really behind the curtain, I guess.
Yeah. It's interesting because, I think, especially for us in our generation, we were always told, well, you all will never match up to what we did in the 60s and the 70s. And so in some ways, it was, I think that for better and for worse, we felt like a little bit alone in it for a little while.
You know what it reminds me of? In the Endless Summer movies where the gag is like everybody shows up at the beach and the old guy says, "Oh, you should have been here yesterday." Do you know what I mean? It's like our whole life has kind of been like that. It's like you should have been here yesterday, and that's why I appreciate too in Can't Stop Won't Stop, just talking about just kind of what the generations mean. And I was wondering just how your thinking's progressed on that. Maybe you can talk a little bit about just that sense of like when people divide groups of people into cohorts or generations, there's like a narrative that's already kind of imposed on that. I wonder if you can just speak a little bit about that and just about how your thinking's changed since you wrote the book.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for asking me that. Because in some ways, I almost feel locked into this book, which I wrote when I was younger.
Yeah.
I wasn't young anymore, but I was younger and very angry still. But the first three words are generations are fictions.
Yes, exactly.
And I think that there was a certain kind of sense that we were those of us who came of age during the 80s and the 90s. We should have been here yesterday.
The waves, wow. The waves, wow.
And so the book was written with a little bit of a chip on my shoulder.
Yeah.
In this idea of things were different in the 80s and the 90s than they were in the 60s. And and that I wanted to kind of explain the popular culture that we had created, which so many folks thought was so vulgar.
Yeah, that's right.
And so violent and so, misogynistic.
Right.
And
homophobic too.
And homophobic in so many kinds of ways. But at the same time, there were all of these things that we, I think, had put into this popular culture that we kind of co-made that explained, how things had changed, and so that's where the book came from.
Yeah, in a way, when every generation comes forward, I think part of what it was a realization that just the way things were didn't have to be the way they were,
right.
And that we were part of making what the future was going to be.
Right.
And so just in the same way, it's like what the radio stations are to have local music on the radio, and that wasn't always the case, and things are going to be different in the future too.
Absolutely.
And that's I think in a way that's what the hip hop generation is to realize that you can be part of the process. Right. You can be making things too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so the closing of the book really is, and there's a picture of it, so I won't be giving too much away for those who haven't read it, but of folks raising their fists.
Yeah.
And the book came out, it ends in 2000, which is sort of, in California, a really crucial moment for the folks who become the part of this generation that are now sort of the elders, I guess, in the progressive movement. There's a lot of stuff that's literally happening in California against this wave of laws.
Yeah, like Yuri Kochiyama, you mentioned her in the book. But yeah, you're right. There's that generation of people who are just slightly older than us, but who showed a lot of leadership.
Well, and younger than us,
and
too.
Younger, yeah.
Mostly younger than us, because at that particular time, we were literally where Arizona is at now.
Yeah.
We were on the tipping point. And so there had been, a decade of laws from 3 strikes to,
you're right.
An anti-undocumented immigrant law
Right.
That was ruled, unconstitutional, anti-bilingual education
Yes,
laws,
totally
anti-affirmative
right.
action
Exactly.
laws.
That was the 1990s in California.
Absolutely. And it culminated at the end of the decade with a bill that basically was a juvenile justice law that exacerbated and accelerated the incarceration of young people of color.
Yeah.
But there was folks who were fighting back against that, and that was our generation that was doing that, I think, and the folks who are now considered part of whatever this generation thing is called. And so the book ends at that particular moment, and I think We're Gonna Be All Right kind of picks up the story where the new generation is coming into the picture, the young folks
the
of
Black Lives Matter
yes,
people,
and the
that
Dreamers,
whole generation.
and,
Yeah, exactly.
Standing Rock folks and the women's marchers.
That's the thing. Is
and stuff like that.
You see what I mean when I said, as somebody, you're an expert in so much that I think is just so important for all of us to see, and to not see these each as isolated incidents, but just part of a broader fabric
and a continuity.
And a continuity, exactly.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just kind of like who your models are, who your great teachers are, because you described that. I love that having those conversations with the Marcos regime.
Marcos,
and the whole time you were saying that, I was like, man, I was talking to the wrong people. I should have been staying up with Jeff that night talking to his friend. But I wonder what kind of what are examples, people you've learned from, kind of wise elders, wise youngers.
The first person I mentioned is a guy named Gary Delgado, who is not really widely, maybe as widely celebrated as known, but he's sort of this huge figure in community organizing. He was the founder of an organization called the Center for Thoroughfare Organizing in Oakland, which trained a whole generation of us who are now kind of out there doing different types of things, from the National Domestic Workers Alliance all the way on through to just pretty much everything that you can imagine in the progressive movement. He and a group of elders in that group trained all of us. So Race Forward is one of his creations. Race Forward, the place that I work at now. And Gary taught me that it's really about narrative at the base of this. That all organizing is about trying to convince people to move from a narrative of I can't do anything to the world is ours, right, and we need to be able to connect this up with all of the other folks who are feeling oppressed, and the tools that we can then give and distribute so that people can find their own power and be able to express that. So Gary was really and remains really a powerful influence on everything I do and think about. And then over the years, people like Grace Lee Boggs.
Oh yeah, right.
You know,
that comes up a lot in the books. What about classes at Berkeley? What classes did you take? Was that just like separate from this whole thing, or was it connected in any way? And then, what advice would you, if you could go back again, how would you approach your education differently? What advice would you kind of give to like young people who are embarking on this massive change of going to college right now? Yeah,
totally. First thing is I'd go to class.
That's good. I got to send that note off the email to the kids right away.
Yeah, I try to remind my kids, go to class.
Yeah.
Because I was working at the radio station. I was at CalX during the evenings, and I was on the on Sproul Plaza during the day. And
right, because I remember you there.
I graduated. I don't know how, but I graduated. But no, I would say that ethnic studies was really key. Ron Takaki was one of my professors, somebody who I really looked up to because he also went to Iolani.
Yeah, right. Isn't that a great connection?
He grew up in Pololo, and he had all these stories about growing up in Hawaii, how he used to, they called him 10 Toes Takaki because he used to hang 10 all the time on a surfboard.
Great. That was a generation where they had all those great nicknames for the guys, when kids named Atomic.
Totally.
And all these great.
Totally. And Ling Chi Wang, the sort of lion of Chinatown is sort of the way I kind of think of him.
Yeah.
Learned a lot from Ron and Ling Chi and Elaine Kim. I didn't study directly with her, but her influence was massive.
Yeah.
And just, sort of that whole generation the first generation of ethnic studies professors were still around to teach us.
Yeah.
And in economics, I remember taking a class with Julianne Malveaux.
Oh, yeah, right.
Around race and gender in the economy. That was really, really influential on my way of thinking. There were a lot of people. And it's funny, I did go to class sometimes.
Well, and you take those classes, and you become an ethnic studies professional, kind of. Do you know what I mean? And it's just like hard to imagine. I mean, like, how did you get from there to here? You know what I mean? You just followed your passion, I guess.
Yeah, I did. True. I basically found at some point that I was not as good a community organizer as I wanted to be. That I loved the story aspect of it. That, at some point, being an organizer is about actually moving people. And I just wanted to sit and actually talk story with everybody.
Yeah.
And so I recognized that at some point that really the thing that I was maybe, destined to do was to be that talk story guy.
Well, I think about that too. But I mean, because especially Can't Stop, Won't Stop. I mean, it's hard to write about music, I think. And I just wonder if you have any suggestions for like your development as a writer. I mean, because that's not an easy place to start. Do you know what I mean? Because almost music by definition, it's kind of, there's a part of it that's kind of outside that narrative. But you do such an effective job of writing about these things that are kind of transcendent, kind of difficult to get your finger on.
Thank you. Yeah, I just I was a really bad like I was a zine guy, so I used to like to write reviews for zines, and thank God I did this under a pseudonym, because most of my reviews, like for the first like 5 or 6 years, like were like, oh, that record's whack, or that record's dope, and like not too much more than that. But I think that at the same time that I was really trying to find the words to describe music, I was also trying to find words to describe who I thought I was and who I thought my peers were, and what we were trying to become, and framing that in the language of politics and history. And so it took me probably about 10 years until I finally figured out until I finally felt like I discovered my voice, and figured out how to talk about change in politics, and the relationship between politics and culture and culture and politics that I was trying to find. But for me, I feel like the culture is what primes political change. Culture moves before politics. Culture moves before policy. And so we have to have the social imagination for change long before we can even imagine change in the politics. And especially now in a period like we've been in probably for the last 15 or 20 years, where it feels like change is impossible in politics. Culture becomes even more important. And so the kinds of things that you do here, the kinds of things that young people are doing in after-school programs where they're doing arts education or hip-hop education, all of that stuff adds up really to creating the possibilities of change. And so we use the metaphor, when I say we, a lot of us who kind of do what we call cultural strategy or narrative strategy, we use actually the narrative of a wave. That the culture is always kind of, the tides are shifting here and there all of the time, but at some point, sometimes a storm comes and a wave comes and sweeps everything in. You're
it's like
you're
an
a surfer,
energy
so like,
that's
the clear out wave, right? Like when you're out there and suddenly something's coming on the horizon, you have to paddle super fast.
Scratching for the...
like, oh, I gotta get out there before it crashes on you, right? Like that's the kind of wave that comes every once in a while, and change then happens very fast. But the culture is setting the stage for that kind of thing all the time. And so, people say, oh, why art? Like, why should we care about art? Things are so bad right now. And I say it's important because we need to be refreshed every once in a while. We can't work on the edge of burnout all the time. And we need to know that there are other people who feel the way that we do. And so there's all of these powerful types of effects that can't be measured in the kind of ways that modern society or postmodern society or post-postmodern society, whatever we're in now. Like,
I love that. We're the post-society. You write about, we're post-civil rights, post-Christian, post-modern,
post-young.
Post-young. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, there's this big case that's coming, the Justice Department is, suing Harvard, and I wonder if you could just help us understand that a little bit. I mean, we read about it in the newspapers, but, it just seems like a very complex dynamic, and I wonder if you can help us to kind of see it a little bit more clearly.
This is so interesting, Rev, because it takes me full circle. Back to the kinds of fights that we had as Asian American activists at Cal.
Completely. That's what I was thinking about. I mean, it's just like, it's like the record skipped or something.
But it's sort of with this weird mirror reverse.
Because one of the things that we didn't talk about when you were talking about the kind of all the retrograde, anti-immigrant legislation of the 1990s. I mean, basically the dismantling of affirmative action at UC meant that the experience that you and I had, it just isn't available for other generations. It really breaks my heart. I mean, I feel like we had something so special that it's in a way it's gone.
We were part of the first. You and I were part of the first class at Cal that was majority minority.
In
1985, and 10 years later, there was this huge attacks on affirmative action, and suddenly it was gone. And so, what had happened during that particular period was there was, I think, a recognition. Ling Chi Wang actually went and did the numbers. He had looked at elite universities, quote unquote elite universities across the country, and saw that Asian American students were topping out at about 15 to 20% of the population at UCLA, at Cal, at Harvard, at Yale, at Michigan, Brown University. These are the schools where he was looking at, and he went into looking at why that was, and found that pretty much in all the cases there had been a shift in admissions requirements sometime around between 84 and 1986 at all of these schools that made it so that if you're looking at strictly the numbers, Asian Americans would actually be disadvantaged in the process in comparison to white students. And so what was supposedly a quote-unquote fair, race-blind, meritocratic system was actually being tilted in favor of whites. And what came out really was that there was a lot of pressure at that time from white legacy folks who had been going to Harvard for years, who had been going to these different types of elite universities for years, to get their kids in, and that they thought that they were being squeezed out by this new generation of Asian Americans. And so Ling Chi got together a group of organizers out here, Henry Durr, Lillian Singh, Ken Kawaichi. They formed a committee. Ken Kawaichi and Lillian Singh were judges, who looked at this particular issue and forced the university to actually begin to disclose a lot of the things that they were doing that were specifically biased against Asian Americans in this particularly supposedly purely meritocratic process. At the same time, we were defending affirmative action. And so Henry ran Chinese for affirmative action at the time. And this was something that we all deeply believed in. But the press saw it as and framed it as an anti-affirmative action thing. Even though that was not at all what we were trying to push for. We actually had an organization that we formed in 1987 called a Student Coalition for Asian Admissions, and it became a Student Coalition for Fair Admissions. The folks who are suing Harvard now took that name from us and flipped it as an attack on affirmative action. After years of trying to put up white women as plaintiffs in these cases, decided it would be more profitable for them to put Asian Americans up and as a way of getting at affirmative action. But our argument back then until now was that this was really about the preservation of whiteness amidst this changing cultural, amidst a changing cultural and demographic shift that was happening. And so when I see the issue coming back these days, I get so many emotions about it.
I can imagine. I mean, it's just like, I felt badly asking about it, but it's so present in our minds now, and just having somebody clarify it is helpful.
Well, so this is partly why I felt like maybe I didn't want to write this personal essay, and We're Gonna Be Right, which is called The In-Betweens. Because for Asian Americans, what it requires us to do is to recognize our privilege, right? And to think about what the end point of change needs to be. And so in the sort of climactic part of the essay, I'm sorry to give this away, but it's really important, is I'm having an argument with an Asian American elder who is talking about the need to get rid of affirmative action because we need to end discrimination against Asian Americans all across the board.
And she's so proud. She comes up to you and just like says, "This is my plan." And then you have to set her right.
And well,
and you're on. You have to tell your story.
It was a very ambivalent moment for me because I knew what my beliefs were, and at the same time, as somebody who grew up in Hawaii, I never faced the kind of discrimination that she had to face. But at the end of the day, my ethics tell me that we need to be creating a public and distributing public goods and public resources and all the things that we share in common to an equitable and a just effect.
Yeah, exactly.
And so the point becomes, at one point, like, is there a point at which justice for Asian Americans no longer means justice for just Asian Americans?
Right, exactly.
And I think that's the thing that we confront, being in between white and black, or white and
you
brown.
know, that's the half-empty version of it, which is, I love it too, because she comes up to you, and it would have been so easy for you to say, yeah, good for you. But I mean, I love the way that you felt compelled to be honest with her about where you stood. Do you know what I mean? That you were like open to that conversation with her. But you know, so the half empty is you know, that what you described, but the half full is your whole career. I mean, it's just like there's a way in which you walk into the world of hip hop culture, you walk into the world of political culture, and it's that in between us is a way of building bridges. That's what I see so much about your. It's like the fact that you didn't grow up as an Asian American and you parachuted in here from Hawaii. I mean, that's a plus, man. I mean, it means that you kind of see things like, you know, from a bigger picture, from like the 30,000-foot view. You know,
maybe, I don't know.
A little bit more than.
I see it as fraught. I just see it as a set of choices that we have to be able to make as being in between, and so it comes down to, for me, asking the question of folks who identify with me and who I identify with as Asian American. Like, what are our ethics? What are the ethics of identity?
Yeah.
And what's the morality of our identity journeys?
Right.
And so if it leads to creating a public high school system here in San Francisco in which the resources of the public educational system are disproportionately directed towards Asian Americans, that's not,
right,
for me, a position that jives with my ethics, with my sense of morality.
Yeah, I appreciated that.
Yeah.
So one of our traditions at the forums, we take questions on the little note cards that are sitting on your seats. I would love to have you take notes and send them up our way. Yeah, I've been thinking. Oh, thank you so much. About just the Trump administration and just kind of the rhetoric that comes out of the Trump administration. I mean, I don't know if you saw Donald Trump had a position on, on how great Christopher Columbus was, and I read it and I just think, yeah, I mean, I just read it and the purpose of that is to be incendiary. The purpose of it isn't to say everybody should recognize the good in human beings, but he's not recognizing the good in human beings. He's drawing a line between us and them. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just kind of what, what's your take on this whole thing that's happening at in the national level, and how deeply immersed we all are in it.
It's a really interesting period to be in, because on the one hand, what Donald Trump does every day is to expose the sort of moral bankruptcy of white supremacy.
Right.
And, even the Kavanaugh hearings, seeing the anger, at the podium and the panel around these kinds of things, and knowing that women, that people of color would never be able to express that kind of anger in the same kind of setting, that they would not have the privilege to be able to do that. I think it's incredibly revealing. But I think the ultimate question becomes, how do we then react to that? And do we react to it in a way that reinforces division, or does it help us get to healing? And I think that what we're sharpening now is our ability to be able to describe the harm that's being done and has been done to us. Yeah. But I think justice is about not just naming the harms that have been done, but also about moving us towards healing so that we can all become whole again.
Yeah.
And so what I worry gets lost in all of our work sometimes is the need to focus on the harm to the detriment of the healing. And I think it's a very difficult line for us to be able to kind of work through. And this is where really I look to people like, the example of Grace Lee Boggs, to help us think about like those kinds of questions, and to you, and folks who are leading from the Spirit, as opposed to the worldly, or maybe not as opposed to, but in addition to the worldly.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And there is it's a moment of opportunity. One of the questions I had on my list was, just like, what do white people need to learn? And partly what this has done is I think it's been a very consciousness raising experience for people of privilege to really see just how racist the greater society that we inhabit is. I mean, everyone knows about it on a statistical basis. I mean, your work on resegregation is just beautiful. I mean, it's just that, all these gains and hopes that we had from the civil rights movement, and how there's been such a terrible retrenchment. But that's definitely part of, so I mean, that's my answer to my own question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So here's a question. The Cal encampment with riot cops called on by the university was the beginning of the end of protest at Cal. Is this true?
No, protests has continued all through the decades, and that part of what I try to stay open to is the need for, and so before I came to this job at Race Forward, I was at Stanford and teaching for 7 years.
Yeah.
And part of what I had come to was trying to find the right balance between, like, here's our story, here's our history, which, to be honest, like, our generation hasn't told very well.
Yeah.
Because we are reacting in some ways to the ways that boomers tried to indoctrinate us. So we became this generation of like, nah, I don't want to hear that,
Yeah.
And I also don't want to be that. So I didn't want to be that person that was always like, this is what happened in the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s that you got to know, kids. Like, I don't want to be that dude, right?
Yeah.
That's like the. And I've had to, though.
Yeah,
and
completely, because you have to tell people what it was like before the internet.
Yeah.
Who else is going to do it?
Was there a time before the internet? Yeah. So it's this like balancing act, but then also like being able to recognize that young folks need to do it their own kind of a way, and. So, so protest has never stopped, and protest will never stop, because there's always, as long as there's a wrong to be righted and justice to be achieved, there's always going to be protest. And I think that for me, it's not the kind of thing where, I'll give you an example. So the students at Stanford in 2014, I want to say, took over the San Mateo Bridge. As a way of protesting police violence, both here and in Palestine, and it was led by Black Lives Matter activists on campus, and a whole bunch of us who were very close to the students were texting each other like, "Did you know that they were going to do this?" And none of us did.
Yeah.
And we were like, dang, like they're going to be in for a world of trouble now.
Oh, yeah.
Because they hadn't done the basic things of figuring out the legal system, all this kind of stuff, blah, 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 blah. All these kinds of things that we could have helped support. And I can say all this stuff now because I'm not employed by Stanford anymore.
Yeah.
But like all of the kinds of things that we could have scaffolded for them to be able to do their thing. But they felt that they needed to make this statement on their own.
Yeah.
And so they had planned this for a month or so without talking to any of us. And at some point, I had to just get over, okay, that's not how it should have been done, but it's the way that it was done, and figure out how to be the best possible support that I could be.
Yeah.
In that.
Oh, that's so interesting. And it does, I mean, it's just like anything. It's just like we're constantly learning how to do things better, and we're learning how to do protests better. And they could have benefited from,
They could have been safer.
Yeah, like best practices, almost.
Yeah.
Okay. What are the merits and demerits starting these conversations in the middle versus talking on the educator role of hand holding, sorry. Do you want to just give it a shot?
Sure. Yeah. Hi. My question, sorry, I have very bad.
No, it's okay. You have fine handwriting. My eyesight's getting bad.
So I read your book, loved it. I asked my mother, who's white, to also read it. She didn't get it at all. So I'm just wondering if you could speak to the merits and detriments of starting these conversations in the middle versus taking on that educator role and handholding and speaking to white or non-Asian audiences.
Yeah.
That's a great
Thank you for that. That's a great question. I guess, part of another thing that I learned from Gary and Grace is you got to start with folks where they're at, and so it's harder for me when I'm, if I'm writing and that kind of thing to be in that kind of a position. I'm writing for sort of an amorphous, imagined kind of audience that's out there, and so I'm trying to think about sort of an abstract ideal of a person that I'm writing to. And sometimes I get that, like, I'm not going to get them from the first sentence. But you, of course, have that ability over the dinner table or, at the door, when you're knocking on the door to be able to kind of connect with them on that. One of the things that we talk about in organizing is it's about sort of you have to affirm, right, that their position, if it's not the position that is yours, that it has value, that they're coming from somewhere on this, right? So you have to kind of affirm their values in engaging them first, right? And then bringing them into that conversation is about sort of finding the connection in that regard. And then it's about countering. It's about sort of then, once you've got them in, leading them to consider different types of questions that they might have considered before. And then sort of the process of transformation that can come out of that particular discussion in which you've had the back and forth a little bit. And it takes a long time sometimes. I mean, I can say personally, for instance, around, say, issues of queerness, that I have loved ones that I struggled with for decades, around, and that they didn't come around, and that at some point, actually, maybe even it was mysterious how they did come around, But it was just one day where I'm hanging out with my gay friends, and they're hanging out with us too, and everything is just lovely, and it's just like, oh, that happened, wow, So it's the engagement piece, is something. It's the thing of there are loved ones, we can't give up on them type of thing that actually undergirds all of organizing, really, And so one of the things that we try to say, I think, is that it's really about the whole revolution. It's not about, this is what Grace says, it's not about bloodshed. It's not about taking one group of power and replacing it with another group of power through bloodshed. It's about transforming our relationships to each other so that we're not in relations that are extractive or exploitative or manipulative, but we're having relations with folks that are mutual, right? That are exchanging, that are about exchange, that are about mutuality is the way that
fairness and openness.
Fairness and mutuality. Mutuality is the way that Martin Luther King puts it, which is this idea that we're all in this together, and that we're both going to benefit through a transformational process. So that's getting all really abstract and stuff.
It is, and Jeff, I think part of it too is that I learn more from my children about race than almost anything else. And the fact is, it's just people are just much more sophisticated in thinking these issues through than they were when we were young. I mean, it's almost the opposite of saying when we were young, but I mean, there's a lot more to learn in it, and so you do have to be kind of patient with the people who are older, who haven't, have acquired that vocabulary even, How would you describe the state of Asian Americans today? Where are we in the wave? And what narratives are missing from Asian America today? What do we need to be talking about in our community? What is the battle of our generation?
Ooh, wow, that's
so profound.
That's whoever asked that question, I'm not going to be able to answer.
It's like the second book after the Bruce Lee book.
I can't. No, but I think
I'll give you this to put in your jacket.
I'll post this on the wall.
Yeah, seriously.
But I think we're co-creating this right now. I think we're actually making this right now. I feel like a lot of we have to hold multiple things at once. We have to hold our privilege. which is not the way that Bill O'Reilly describes a privilege. Like, he talks about Asian American privilege as a way of substituting Asian Americans for whites who are being racist. Like, oh, you think that whites are racist? Well, Asian Americans are just as privileged and just as racist, is the way that he's really trying to put it. And we are like, that's at work in our families, in our communities. We have to be able to challenge that. We have to be able to name that and challenge that. But not in the way and not for the reasons that Bill O'Reilly is doing it, which is to proxy a group of us in to be able to, as Edward Bloom is doing in this admissions case. So I think that we need to be able to have those discussions in the open. And I think the battle of Asian Americans now is the battle really of everyone, which is that we are coming up in the middle of the century on a demographic shift that's going to be irreversible.
Yeah.
Right? That is that we're going to all become minorities. And if we're all minorities, then how do we imagine what a new majority is going to look like? Right? And so what that means is that we have to be able to transform ourselves to think about how we bring about this new majority. And to bring about this new majority, does that mean that we're going to be arguing, for further segregation in public schools, for further income inequality, wealth inequality, or are we going to be arguing that the resources of this country be distributed equally to all? And what does that mean for us? What does that mean in terms of what we have to do as Asian Americans? Where do we need to get out of the way? Where do we need to enable? Where do we need to step up? Where do we need to advocate for ourselves?
This is almost an addendum to that question. Can you talk and explain how Asian Americans inhabit a space in between white and black-brown? Mm-hmm. So that's a little bit.
Yeah. So it's partly an existential type of question, in the way that. And I think we often talk about it as how the media portrays us, right? As if the media is somehow somewhere generating all of these narratives about us. If we look at history, this is how the country is founded. That we are here because of the Black freedom struggle. That we're here because that birthright citizenship is the result of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, and the fight for that the Immigration and Nationality Act was one of the last pieces of the civil rights legislation that was passed. And it was done because the civil rights movement had shifted the culture towards a consensus for civil rights. And that's, the reason that we've had such huge immigration. And so on the one hand, the defining marks of slavery and genocide, have set in place the way that we understand race, and at the same time, the movements for freedom that have come out to counteract the impacts of slavery and genocide have made it possible for Asian Americans to be able to be here, right? So we're in between in that regard. We're literally in between, and I think that our responsibility in that regard is to be able to recognize those histories, to make them a part of who we are and how we act as we move ourselves forward. We're all interconnected, right? And so and here's the thing, right? Here's the thing about the battle around emissions. The reason it inspires so much passion amongst Asian parents is because it's all framed as a zero-sum game. Right?
Right, totally is.
Admissions is the perfect frame, right, for the right to be able to kind of define, well, you're all going to have to get yours, and if you get yours, then somebody else is going to lose. Right? Which is essentially how Trumpian kind of rhetoric functions.
It's a rhetoric of scarcity. There's not enough, and some people are going to get some, and it means that others can't.
And that others just can't. And you don't deserve it, by the way.
Right.
And so, that's what creates the anxiety. But we devote our attention to Kumon programs, to SAT prep, to having a whole, industry of essay writers to try to get our kids into the quote-unquote elite universities. What if all of that energy was being devoted towards improving neighborhood public education? That's a completely different type of look and mindset, and would yield benefits for Asian Americans of all classes, backgrounds, and everybody else as well. And so it's the question of what does it mean to be Asian American in this particular period. Well, it's complicated. It's not just about pride at being able to see Crazy Rich Asians, I guess, or whatever, right?
Or Fred Korematsu.
Yeah, Fred or that kind of thing. It's also about thinking about what does it mean to help to support and in some cases lead these kinds of questions and discussions.
Yeah. Well, we have a lot more questions here, but we have church starting soon.
Yes.
But with the other questions we have are about resegregation in the Bay Area, which I would love to hear more. Someone asked about just the cultural, when you say culture moves policy, this person asked questions about the white legacy culture being resurrected by Donald Trump, which is a great question too. Other Trump questions, and the one last question is, as an Asian American Pacific local hero, what is your message to minority communities in the United States? So that was one of the.
It's not just to minority communities, but to all of us. That what we're trying to get to is a horizon line of justice in which there is freedom for all. And it's a horizon line because we're never actually going to reach it.
Right.
But that's not any reason to be down about this. We need to fight for equity because equity is the measure of our progress towards that line. And we all need each other in this. And so, ultimately, my message is about our need to be able to recognize in each other, the love and the community that we need to be able to make together.
And that's what you referred to too. There's like a spiritual value, which is a sense of connection and oneness, where these barriers are not dividing us from each other, but invitations to learn a new story. Yeah. I'm so grateful to have you, Jeff. I mean, it's just like we're so encouraged by your work and so grateful for all you're doing. I mean, it's you've just done some extraordinary things. I'm looking forward to seeing what you do next too.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah. So next week we're going to be having Naomi Tutu, Desmond Tutu's daughter, who will be here. She'll be here at the forum, and then she's also preaching the sermon at the 11 o'clock service. So it should be a really great time to be here. We're supported by your donations, so please be sure to leave a donation in the donation box if you're able to. And then the service at 11 o'clock is going to be a beautiful service. I'll be preaching the sermon, and the men and boys choir will be there. It should be really great. And we have, in the back row, we have one of our own ethnic studies professors. Dorothy Saruda is back there. She's an ethnic studies professor. I think the two of you might have something in common somewhere. All right, well, thank you so much. Let's thank Jeff for